something to you then, Alyssa, and you're going to take this to heart, and you're going to ponder this, and you're going to think about this. If you are if you are closing off yourself to movies before the '90s, you are, dude, you are missing out. You are missing out big time. So, I I love I love doing video clips with my seventh graders. I love doing video clips with you guys. We're going to see a lot of video clips throughout the course of the year. A lot of them are based on movies. Some of the greatest movies. I just had this conversation with Mr. Cabana a moment ago. In October, HBO is premiering, and we're recording, so we're ready to go. Open up yesterday's PowerPoint, the one we were working on yesterday. And then later in class, we're going to look at the one I linked to a moment ago, packet 2. But Mr. Cabana and I were talking. HBO is starting, they're going to release a new movie October 3rd called Salem's Lot. Okay? Salem's Lot is based on a Stephen King book of the same name. And Stephen King's book, Salem's Lot, is basically about a town in Maine that's inhabited by vampires. And in 1979, they made a television movie of Stephen King's book. It was a 4-hour movie over 2 nights. And without question, it was one of the scariest movies I've ever seen in my life. To this day, I watch it and I still get kind of wigged out by it. So anyway, I told Mr. Cabana that HBO is making a Salem's Lot like a reboot, a new movie, a new version. And we're both feeling kind of the same way. Sometimes when they do a remake of a movie that's really, really good, they end up turning it into a piece of cow flop. They end up turning it into a really, really horrible remake. So I am going to recommend Miss Edgehill, because you're one of my favorite 11th grade students, and because I love having you in my social studies class. I'm going to recommend that you watch, pick a movie from any decade before the 2000s. If you give me a genre, a type of movie, I'll give you a movie from that decade you can watch. So you don't have to tell me now. Be thinking about a type of movie, drama, comedy, horror, romance, rom-com, whatever. I'll give you a movie from that decade. But I need a couple days. Okay. All right, so you think on it. All right. Just a reminder, I know this is way, way off. June 20th, Regents. Okay? I share that because I want you to mark it down in your calendars. I've had, and you don't have to mark it down now, but last year in this building, I'm not naming names, but there were students who had Regents scheduled all year long, and were taking family vacations the second week of June on the same day Regents occurred. Guys, please, plug these dates in. You don't want to take a Regents level, you don't want to take a college level Regents course, and not sit for the Regents at the end of the school year because you're, whatever, you've slept in or you go on vacation. So June 20th, it'll be 8 o'clock in the morning, most likely 8:15. We have a long ways to go from there to there, but I just wanted to let everybody know that. You don't have a quiz tomorrow or Friday, you don't have an Inquisitive due Friday. You have a Inquisitive due next week and a quiz next Friday in your vocab chapter 6. Yesterday, end of class, we were talking about the major debates, and we talked about these 4 items. We talked about the debate in Congress was over how states would be represented in the new Congress. When we talk about the Congress, what branch of government am I referring to? The lawmaking branch, the legislative branch. So when we talk about representation in Congress, we're talking about how will each state be represented in the new Congress? How will each of the 13 states be represented? Also, the major debate was over powers of the federal government. We talked a lot yesterday, and we're going to talk more today about slavery and the 3/5 compromise, and we talk about the executive branch structure. I wanted to spend a moment on this last slide before we open up our new packet. The Great Compromise, and it's often going to be called the Connecticut Compromise. The Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise is the compromise that will basically finalize how the Congress will be established. The Great Compromise will end up with a two-house legislature, bicameral, two-cameral house, two-house legislature. What are the houses called? Just from your knowledge of government today. The same two houses exist today as they did in 1787. The House of Representatives and the United States Senate. Those are the two houses, bicameral legislature. House of Representatives are going to be based on population. Okay? So states will have more members in the House of Representatives from their state if their population is larger. Smaller states will have fewer representation in the House of Representatives. And the best example of this is us and our state neighboring us to the east. New York State, big population, multiple millions. We have 26 members in the House of Representatives in New York. 26. Vermont, our neighbor to the east, is a tiny population state, a population of only about 800,000 people. How many members does Vermont have in the House of Representatives? How many? You say two? You say how many? One. One member in the House, okay, because of their population. Now, where each states are equal in the Congress, every state is going to have two senators regardless of the state's what? Population. Every state will have two senators regardless of the population, and that is going to be the Great Compromise. Now, we're going to get into this a little bit more today, but that is just, for now, where I want to stop, and I want to take a moment to open up. Once you can keep both PowerPoints open, but open up the second PowerPoint that I plugged onto your Google Classroom stream. It's going to be labeled packet number 2. Packet number 2. Is it out there, guys? Okay, it should have appeared a little while ago. And we're going to pick up with the first slide on packet number 2, and we're going to continue talking about key debates and key decisions at the convention. All right, the convention, we said, lasted from May through September. It ended yesterday, by the way. I mentioned yesterday. Yesterday is the anniversary the Constitution was adopted, September 17th. The convention was about 2.5 months in Philadelphia. Hot, humid, 1787. It was typical upstate Pennsylvania weather in this type of climate. And for 3 months, they basically duked it out. They argued, they debated, and oftentimes it was very contentious. The big elephant in the room, we said yesterday, was slavery, and slavery is going to dominate the conversation. Even though they weren't talking about it, everybody was thinking about it, especially Southern delegates at the convention, who were going to do everything they could to hold on to the institution of slavery. I will tell you this, a student asked me last year, why at the Constitutional Convention do the writers of the document not address the issue of slavery then and there? How does a new country, born with freedom and equality and independence as part of its founding beliefs, how does that country allow slavery to exist at the country's inception? I'm going to answer the question by saying the following. Had Northerners persisted, had the Northern states persisted at the time of the convention to outlaw slavery when they were writing the Constitution, the Southern delegates would have walked out of the convention. The white Southern delegates representing the Southern slaveholding states, the slaveholding delegates would have walked out of the convention, and there would not have been an adjustment to the Articles. There would not have been the rewriting of a new Constitution. To use a phrase that we probably all heard when we were younger, the Southern delegates would have packed up their toys and they would have went home. They were not going to let Northern states end slavery. So they threatened, if any movement was made to abolish slavery at the new Constitutional Convention, Southern states made it abundantly clear they would pack up and leave. Now, that issue of slavery will be addressed at the convention, but it will not be solved, especially if you were an African American slave and or even free blacks. Free blacks still face challenges in the United States after the Constitutional Convention. But if you were a slave in any of the southern states, you're going to have to wait. Do the math. 1787 was the convention. Slavery will not be officially abolished until 1865. So it's going to be about 78 years. It's going to be about 78 years until the issue will finally be resolved with the 13th Amendment. Does everybody have the second PowerPoint open? All right. Real brief, and again, recap from yesterday to kind of get us where we need to get today. Am I going good pace today? All right. The convention, as I said, took place in Philly. 12 of 13 states attended. Rhode Island was the only state that did not attend. 12 of 13 states attended. Rhode Island. And the attendance varied. Day to day, there might have been different representatives from each state. There are some states, some days there were maybe fewer delegates from each state, but generally speaking, 12 of the 13 states attended, and there were upwards of 55 different men that attended the convention. The goal initially was to address the weaknesses of the articles, and instead of addressing the weakness of the articles, thanks to James Madison, the delegates decided to do what? Throw it out and start a brand new constitution to bet. And now, again, this wasn't, by the way, this wasn't helter-skelter, and it wasn't kind of fly-by-night, to use a phrase that my mom and dad, you don't want to, I don't want you to think this was fly-by-night. They didn't make this up overnight. James Madison came to the convention from Virginia with the intention of proposing a new constitution. A lot of the other delegates didn't know about it, but James Madison knew that he wanted a new constitution. He knew the articles weren't going to work. He felt that they were going to be insufficient. So the goal was to tweak the articles, but they ended up, as you guys correctly pointed out, doing a whole new rewrite, a whole new constitution. All right? Let's take a peek at our author's video on this topic. Now, I've been working out some tech glitches the last couple of days, so I think I'm pretty smooth here.
The American Revolution gained independence for the 13 states, but it did not really create a new nation. In fact, the Declaration of Independence doesn't even mention the word nation. Americans were so concerned about the abuse of power that they had suffered from under Great Britain that they intentionally created a new government that was protective of the 13 American states and their independence from one another. The government created during the American Revolution, called the Confederation government because of the Articles of Confederation that outlined its provisions, did not have a president, did not have a chief executive, did not have a judiciary, didn't have the power to tax. It depended on the states to voluntarily contribute funds for the operation of the national government. As a result of those weaknesses, in 1787, the individual states agreed at long last that they needed a new constitution and a more powerful national government.
Let's connect that with yesterday. Who can tell me what was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back that resulted in the calling of the Constitutional Convention? Shays' Rebellion in Springfield, Massachusetts. It points out that the government has to have more powers in order to function. The federal government had to have more power, they believe, to be able to function properly. So with that in mind, let's go back and take a peek at the next slide, which is going to talk about the two plans that arise at the convention. This stuff, don't worry about that. That's graphics that I just kind of plugged in there, and I can't enlarge it, and I don't have a copy to give you, but I want to focus on the two plans. The two plans that were proposed for the legislative branch. Again, this plan, we're going to talk first about the first branch of government, the legislative branch. The two plans that were proposed, and by the way, how many branches in our federal government? three: legislative, executive, and judicial. So the legislative branch, there were two plans. The Virginia plan, which was supported by Virginia and the large populated states, and the New Jersey plan, which was supported by the smaller populated states, led by New Jersey and William Patterson. All right. Now, the Virginia plan, let's talk about similarities and differences. The Virginia plan, again, backed by large populated states, proposed a strong national government with three branches. Strong national government with three branches. The Jersey plan favored a one-house legislature with equal representation in each state. Virginia plan proposed a strong national government with three branches, and the Jersey plan favored a one-house legislature with equal representation for states. Which plan do you think best suited the smaller states, less populated states? When we talk about small states, I'm not talking geographic size, I'm talking about populations. Which of the two plans would have been supported, do you think, better hailing by smaller states? New Jersey plan. Why? How many states were there in 1787? If every state had the same number of votes in the Congress, so there was one house legislature and every state had the same number of votes. Let's say every state had one vote, or every state had two votes in Congress. Why would the smaller states really want that plan? They would go gaga over the opportunity to have the same number of votes as, let's say, Pennsylvania or Virginia. Haley. So little people in New Jersey, by having the same number of votes in the Congress, it gives them essentially the same amount of power as states that are much larger. So the smaller states are going to like that plan. Why are the larger states not going to like the New Jersey plan, Alyssa? Why would states like Virginia and Massachusetts not like the New Jersey plan? They got more people. They feel we should have more power. The larger states say, hey, if we have more people living here, we should have more of a say in government. And the smaller states are like, well, just because you have more people doesn't mean that, we're going to want you to have the power to walk all over us. So there has to be some kind of compromise between those two views. So let's look at the compromise. The Great Compromise combined elements of both plans. The Great Compromise combined elements of both plans. So what's going to happen? We create a two-house legislature, a House of Representatives and a Senate. Okay, we create a two-house legislature, not a one-house like the New Jersey plan proposed, but a two-house legislature. And there are elements of both the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan that exist. For example, I'm going to highlight this here. Bicameral legislature, two-house legislature, where the House of Representatives is one house, that will be based on population. Which group of states is going to like the fact that the House is going to be determined based on a state's population? Large states, the populous states. The other compromise here is you got the Senate, where each state has equal representation. Each state is going to have, how many senators do we say, Ava? Two. Which group of states are especially going to enjoy that? The smaller states. This is why, if you look at Vermont, tiny population, 800,000 maybe, compared to New York, which has upwards of 20 million. But in the United States Senate, those two states, despite their disparity in population, they are on an equal what? They're on an equal footing in the Senate. Now, where they're not on an equal footing in terms of representation. New York State, with a population of approaching 20 million, has 26 members in the House of Representatives. Vermont, though, has one. Vermont has one. So, when I teach this and when I read about it, I've studied the Constitution my entire life. This compromise is actually pretty brilliant in the sense that small states have representation in the equal representation in the Senate, and larger states have more power in the House because of their population. We're really giving both sides something that they want at the convention and something that they demand. So that is the great compromise. Jot this down in your notes. The great compromise was the compromise at the convention that created the judicial. I'm sorry, did I say judicial? I didn't mean judicial. That created the legislative branch of the Congress. The Great Compromise creates the Congress. And that Congress, guys and gals, is identical today in its shape, in its formation, as it was in 1787. Every state has 2 U.S. senators, and every state has a House contingency that's determined based on its population. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. You may or may not know the answer, but if you think it through, I think you'll be able to figure this out without a lot of prompting. Can an individual state's representation in the House of Representatives change over time? And if so, how? We've already agreed that U.S. senators in every state is always forever going to be what? 2. Can House representation in a state change over time? On it. Yes, how? The population of a state rises or a population of a state falls, you are going to see commensurate adjustments to House representation, and that's done every 10 years when what is performed. How do we get a count on the number of people in each state or each country every year? We do this every 10 years, and this is vital that you complete it every 10 years. Next one will be in 2030. No? Every 10 years, the country takes what's called a census. And the census is basically to get a count on the number of people that live in each community, each county, each state. And that census, that population count, is used to determine how many seats are afforded in the House or how many seats are apportioned for. Now, I can tell you right now, and it's going to make sense to you, New York, when I was a high school junior, sitting where you're sitting in 1982. Yes, I'm that old. All right? When I was a high school junior, sitting in 1982, New York State had 34 seats in the House of Representatives. How many do we have now? What observation, Lizzie, can you make then between 1982 and 2024 about New York's population? If I had 35 seats in 1982 and there's 26 now, we're losing population. We're losing population. What happens? People are moving to other states, and as people leave New York for a number of reasons, okay, weather, ice, snow, taxes, cost of living, political atmosphere, whatever, other states that might be gaining those numbers in population, what might happen to their representation in the House of Representatives? It can go up. That's what's happening in Florida. That's what's happening in Texas. That's what's happening in a lot of southern states. So as we lose numbers, who knows the number of members in the House in total? And this number will be constant. As long as there are 50 states, this number will be constant. Yeah. 365? Dude, you're off. You're so close. You said 365. That's the number of days in a year. There are 435 members in the House of Representatives. Okay? 435 members in the House, 100 members in the Senate. So, Dylan, if I were to ask you on a quiz or on your regents to talk about the number of members in the U.S. Congress in total, you would tell me how many? 535. 535. And if you add 3 to that, Washington, D.C., not a state. Washington, D.C. is not a state, but they do have 3 votes in the Electoral College. So we're going to talk about that magic number again. Guys, we talked about this the first week of school, yes? 538. Why is that a magic number, Ms. Salzwell?
Because that's like how many, I don't know what I'm trying to say.
Electoral College, electoral votes. And the race to the White House that we'll see in about 6 weeks will be won by the candidate who reaches what number first? 270, which is a majority of that number. I saw some polling information last night. This is post-debate. This is after the debate between Vice President Harris and former President Trump, and also it's after the attempted assassination over the weekend. Pennsylvania has gone, last week it was kind of leaning toward Democrat. Pennsylvania is now leaning toward Republican, and right now, according to most polls, Trump has a very, very, very slim margin in some of the swing states. We are going to be in, unless something drastic happens between, and trust me, it's been a weird election, or something drastic could happen, but unless something really drastic happens to one of the candidates, it's going to be a very, very, very close election. And it's going to be decided by probably less than 50,000 votes in the course of 6 or 7 swing states. Pennsylvania is really close right now. Iowa is really close right now. Georgia's close. North Carolina's close. But that's the magic number. And guys, the beauty of this, the Great Compromise, is that our Congress, every aspect of that Great Compromise is as meaningful today as it was in 1787 at the convention. Questions? So that's the legislative branch. All right, now, this is by far one of the coolest topics to learn about. It also is one of the most tragic for hundreds of thousands of African American slaves who, while these guys were sitting in a hot room in Philadelphia in 1787, debating House, Senate, population, not a one of those almost 1 million slaves in 1787 are going to have a say about what goes on in that human building in Philadelphia. We're going to see how that issue is addressed right now. And I talked a little bit about the 3/5 compromise yesterday. We're going to look today at, specifically, we're going to kind of dive deep as we can in the next 3 or 4 minutes. We're going to dive deep into what happens with the issue of slavery. Now, Miss Howard, you've been quiet today, so I'm going to pick on you. We've recognized that representation matters. You go back to the previous slide. A state's population is going to matter when it comes to determining members of what body of Congress? House of Representatives. You got it. That's not the question, though. The question is on this slide. There you go. Why are southern states going to want to include every last slave in their population counts at this convention in Philadelphia? To try to get as many representatives in the House of Representatives that they can get. if slave populations are counted in full, southern states will be able to basically accumulate more seats in the House. Meaning, if their numbers are larger than the northern states, the southern states will have more what over the northern states in the Congress? More power. Conversely, Alyssa, why are the northern states going to say at the convention, southern states should not be able to count any of their slaves in their population counts? Why would a northerner make that argument? Because slaves were not considered human beings, and northerners don't want to have to compete with the southern states for political power. So the northern states don't want any slaves to be counted in population counts. Slave states want all their slaves to be counted. There's going to have to be a what to settle it. You meet in the middle with me, and we reach a compromise. All right? So this 3/5 compromise, and this is tragic. This, if you think about this for a second, when I'm done with this explanation, what's most tragic for me when I teach this and when we talk about it is that the 3/5 compromise is basically, it's totally disavowing, it's totally not counting 40% of the country's citizens in our in our population count. All right? The 3/5 compromise addressed how enslaved people would be counted for representation and taxation. Okay? Each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a person. Okay? Each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a person. So rather than saying to South Carolina and the delegates from South Carolina and Virginia, rather than saying, all right, we don't want to count any of your slaves, Northerners and Southerners agree that, hey, we can count 3,000 out of every 5,000, or 30 out of every 50, or 300 out of every 5, whatever the fraction is. 3 out of every 5 slaves will be counted, which means how many won't be counted? 2. Each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a person. And what impact would this have on political power in the southern states? Initially, it is going to limit southern political power, because if slave states were able to count all their slaves in their population counts, they would have had a lot more power right off the bat when the new country constitution was founded. But Northerners knew, they had a good idea how many slaves each state had. They had a good feel for what, so Northerners, when they come up with this 3/5 number as a number to agree on, Northerners recognized that as a number that they could live with. Northerners, Northern delegates. Southerners wanted all their slaves to count, but nobody got entirely everything that they wanted. If one side got the better of the deal, we said it was who? Southerners, because they're getting to count more than how many of their slaves? More than half of their slaves. Okay? More than half of their slaves. Did I explain that in a way that you guys understand? If I were to ask you, Anna, if I were to ask you how population counts were important in determining the makeup of the legislative branch of our government, how would you respond to that? What significance do population counts play in setting up our Congress? More population in a state means you're going to have more members in what body? The House of Representatives. Okay? House of Representatives. And as far as the Senate goes, it really didn't matter in terms of apportionment, because every state is going to have 2 senators regardless of the state's population. So the debate over slavery is largely a debate over membership in the House of Representatives. Okay? What are southern states going to be encouraged to do in order, if they agree on this 3/5 compromise, which the delegates agreed to when the convention ends, if southern states agree to that, what can they do after the Constitution goes into effect to make sure that they become more powerful as southern slaveholding states. If they're only able to count 3 out of every 5 slaves, what can you do to ensure that your power grows over time if you're a southern state? Palin. Breed slaves, breed more slaves, good, or buy more, or where are they coming from? Large numbers of slaves. They're being imported, they're being taken from the interior of Africa, and they're being forced on slave ships across the Atlantic. So Southerners, after the convention, are basically committed to breeding more slaves and importing more slaves. Now, importing slaves is going to be difficult after 1808. Importing slaves will be difficult after 1808 because in 1808, remember I used the phrase yesterday, the Constitutional Convention kicked the issue of slavery down the road a little bit. Did I use that phrase? 1808, 20 years after the convention, a law goes into effect saying that the United States will no longer allow the importation of slaves from Africa. 1808, 20 years after the Constitutional Convention. The United States will no longer allow, and Katie, you're getting another question here, right? So be on the lookout, BOLO, all right? If the slave importation was banned from Africa after 1808, why does the number of slaves after 1808 go from about 1 million to about 4 million in 1860? If you can't bring more slaves in from Africa because of the law in 1808, how in the world are the population of slaves going to rise from 1 million to 4 million in the American South? And that's what will happen. Between 1808 and 1860, the amount of slaves will rise from 1 million to 4 million. How and why? You can't import them from Africa anymore. How are you going to get new slaves? They're going to be breed. They're going to be bred. They're going to be bred, and a lot of people are going to ignore the non-importation laws. There's going to be slaves that will be smuggled into the United States after 1808. There are going to be slaves that are brought here in violation of the law. Do you think those laws, especially in southern states, do you think southern anti-importation laws, do you think they were enforced in southern states? No. You've got to look at it like this. White Southerners, regardless of the law in 1808, white Southerners viewed slavery not as human beings, but viewed slaves as pieces of property. Okay? Let's take a look at our author's video. We'll close on this topic today.
One of the most important developments in colonial American history involved the transition from indentured servants being the primary source of labor in the colonies to slavery, race-based slavery. That began to occur in earnest in the late 17th century as the number of enslaved Africans increased dramatically. One result of that increasing population, especially in the southern colonies such as Virginia and the Carolinas, was that those white-controlled colonies felt the need to create what were called slave codes, which strictly defined the freedom, or lack thereof, of African slaves. Those slave codes designated what punishments were available to owners, whippings. They could even kill slaves if they resisted. At the same time, it created a structure whereby white colonists could form vigilante posses to round up any runaway slaves that escaped. So the system of race-based slavery became codified. It became part of a law by the end of the 17th century. And during the 18th century, race-based slavery became the norm in the southern colonies rather than the exception.
Again, after the revolution, what did we say yesterday and Monday starts to happen to slavery in the northern states? It starts to die out. But southern states, we do not see that. We see a proliferation, a growth in the instances and the ownership of slaves. And we'll stop at that point. We'll pick up tomorrow where we left off. Palin and Haley are here tomorrow night. You're here tomorrow night for your... Thanks, guys.